the year 1470, something happened in the mountains of Greece that history almost erased completely. 23 women disappeared. They were not killed in battle. They were not executed publicly. Their names were never written in the official chronicles of the empire that captured them. They simply vanished. For 5 centuries, their story remained buried beneath silence. Then, in 2011, archaeologists restoring sections of the old Ottoman Imperial Palace in Istanbul discovered something strange. Behind a false wall deep beneath the foundations of the palace, they uncovered a sealed chamber that had not been opened for hundreds of years. Inside the room, the stone walls were covered with small scratches. Dozens of crude crosses had been carved into the rock, and beneath them were 4 words written in trembling Latin. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. Those words were not written by soldiers. They were not written by priests or scholars. They were written by prisoners. And historians now believe they may have been the final message left behind by a group of nuns taken from a forgotten convent in the mountains of Thessaly. But to understand how 23 women ended up carving messages beneath an imperial palace, we must go back to a moment when an empire was expanding across the world faster than anyone believed possible. The year was 1453. Constantinople was falling. For more than 1,000 years, the city had stood as the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Massive walls surrounded it, stronger than anything Europe had ever built. Armies had attacked those walls for centuries and failed. But Sultan Mehmed II arrived with a new weapon. Cannons. Gigantic bronze cannons capable of smashing through stone fortifications that had stood since the Roman Empire. For 53 days, the city endured bombardment. Cannon fire shook the ground. Towers collapsed. Buildings burned. The air filled with smoke and dust, while citizens prayed inside churches for salvation. But the walls could not hold forever. One morning, they finally broke. Ottoman soldiers poured into Constantinople like a tidal wave. Within hours, the transformation began. The great cathedral of Hygia, Sophiatha, spiritual center of the Byzantine world, was stripped of its crosses. Golden mosaics were covered with plaster. Church bells were melted down to forge weapons. And where priests had once sung sacred hymns, beneath the great dome, the call to prayer began echoing across the city. The Byzantine Empire had fallen, but Sultan Mehmed understood something deeper than simple military victory. Destroying a city is easy. Destroying memory is much harder. If people continue to remember who they once were, resistance can survive for generations. Stories are told. Songs are written. Mottos become legends. So the Ottoman Empire developed a strategy that was quieter, but far more effective. Instead of creating martyrs, they created disappearances. Communities that refused to convert were not always destroyed publicly. Many were quietly removed. Their people absorbed into imperial systems where their languages, traditions, and identities slowly faded. Across Greece, the Balkans, and Anatolia, entire monasteries began disappearing from history. One of those places was a small convent hidden high in the mountains of Thessaly. The Convent of Saint Catherine. Inside its stone walls lived 23 women who had devoted their lives to prayer. They were not warriors. They carried no weapons. Most had never seen a battlefield. Their days were filled with quiet routines, tending gardens, copying manuscripts, caring for the sick in nearby villages. Their armor was faith. Their weapons were wooden rosaries. For years, the outside world had forgotten they existed, until the Ottoman army arrived. The first cannonball struck just after sunrise. Stone exploded outward from the convent walls. Dust filled the courtyard where the sisters once grew herbs for medicine. But the most terrifying moment came when the gates finally broke open, because the soldiers who entered did not behave like conquerors. They behaved like administrators. Instead of charging forward with raised swords, they carried ledgers, ink, and quills. They moved calmly through the convent, recording everything they saw. The buildings were catalogued, valuable objects were listed, and finally the women themselves were counted. To the Ottoman Empire, the 23 nuns were not enemies. They were inventory. A translator stepped forward and read the official decree. By order of Sultan Mehmed II, all inhabitants of conquered lands must submit to imperial authority. Those who convert will receive protection and new lives within the empire. Those who refuse will face the consequences of rebellion. The abbess, Sister Eleni, stepped forward calmly. She held a small silver crucifix in her hands, a relic passed through generations of nuns before her. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Tell your sultan," she said, "that we have already given our lives to a greater king." The Ottoman commander, Hassan Pasha, smiled slightly, because he understood something the nuns did not. Dead martyrs inspire rebellion. Broken people do not. That night, the women were locked inside their chapel without food or water. Outside, the soldiers built fires and ate, while the sisters sat in darkness. Two of the youngest nuns began to cry quietly. Then Sister Magdalena, barely 19 years old, began whispering a psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd." Another voice joined her. Then another. Soon the chapel filled with quiet prayer. The soldiers believed they were witnessing suffering, but the nuns had spent their entire lives preparing for hardship, fasting, silence, discipline. Their faith was not decoration. It was strength. On the second day, the chapel doors opened. Fresh bread and water were placed before them. No one touched it. On the third day, their lips cracked from thirst and their bodies trembled with weakness. Still, they refused to surrender. So Hassan Pasha changed his strategy. If they would not convert, they would walk to Constantinople. If their faith survived the journey, the Sultan himself would judge them. At dawn on the fourth day, 23, women left the convent with their hands bound. They began walking south, toward the sea. The journey lasted 7 days. On the second day, the oldest nun collapsed. Two younger sisters carried her until nightfall, but by morning she had died. They buried her beside the road with their bare hands. Hassan Pasha opened his ledger. 22 remaining. Days later, another woman stopped walking. Then another. By the time they reached the port of Olos, only 18 women were still alive. They were chained inside an Ottoman war galley bound for Constantinople. The voyage lasted 12 days. Storms battered the ship. Salt water burned their wounds. Prisoners vomited until they had nothing left. Each night, Sister Magdalena whispered prayers into the darkness of the ship's hold. Other prisoners listened. For a moment, her voice held the entire ship together. When the galley finally entered the Bosphorus, Constantinople rose before them like a city of gold. But for the nuns of Saint Catherine, it would become a prison. They were taken beneath the imperial palace, into tunnels that did not appear on official maps. There, hidden beneath the foundations of the empire, the last survivors continued to pray. They carved crosses into the stone walls. They whispered hymns. In the darkness, they refused to forget who they were. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The Ottoman Empire itself eventually disappeared, but the small marks carved into those stone walls remained. Lux in tenebris, lucet, the light shines in the darkness. Proof that 23 forgotten women once stood against the power of an empire, and even after 500 years, the darkness never erased them.